Well, we're getting close to the end of this sermon series on Jim's book, Embracing the Love of God, and we're at part 7, Caring for Ourselves. And this is one of the most challenging, one of the most difficult, one of the most important of all the chapters. And so I want you to put your seatbelt on here, because this is not a sermon that I'm going to have people say, "Oh, Pastor, that was just such a powerful sermon." In fact, you're going to leave today saying, "I wish he wouldn't have preached that sermon." Do you see why I'm saying put your seatbelt on? Are you all still with me? Now, in light of that, I think that it's really important that we remind ourselves as to the foundation upon which all of what we're talking about in this book is built. This is really important. So I want you to see a video, it's only 2 minutes long, by a pastor who is in the Salvation Army. And her name is Danielle Strickland. She is an incredibly gifted communicator, and she shares her own journey as a way of describing why this foundation is so important. So let's watch it together.
I used to think that God was angry or at least perpetually disappointed in me because I could never really measure up to religious standards, really. And one day I was in a fairly low place in my life and I had an encounter with God. It sounds unbelievable, but really God showed up and showed up as love. And to realize that God was love was for me a real shock. And what I realized was that God was for me and not against me. When I realized God was for me in spite of my, it didn't matter what I had done or I hadn't done or that I didn't measure up or that I wasn't enough. That God was not angry. He wasn't keeping lists of things I'd done he's going to get me for later. He wasn't perpetually disappointed for me. He actually loved me like someone who was lost, which is probably the best definition of what I was, lost. And what I found that day was not just some kind of a religion or not some rules, and I actually didn't get much better in some regards for a long time. What I found was love. What I found was belonging. What I found was acceptance. What I found was God who was for me and not against me. And when I got that, it was like someone turned a light on inside of me. And for the first time, I could see. And I had a way to go, a place to go to. And ever since that day, really, that's what I've been doing, is just following this God who is for me and not against me, and who has a way for me to go. And if you could, first of all, understand that God is love and that he's for you and not against you, and you could allow him to just turn on a light in you, where you could begin to see things as they really are, things that matter, things that are true, things that are worthy, things that you could do and be part of. It would change things.
So you see, if you struggle with that message, if there's any part of you that resists that or finds it challenging to accept, then this whole sermon on caring for yourself is dangerous. Because when we talk about caring for ourselves, the danger is that people will say that self-care is selfish. And if you struggle with the love of God for you, you will turn self-care into something that is a no-no, something that is selfish rather than life-giving. So everybody's in a different place on the journey, and I hope that you're aware of where you are. Can you 100% without any hesitation say, there's nothing I can do to get God to love me more or less? Now, if you wrestle with that, just be honest with yourself. But as we talk about self-care, it's built on that foundation of God's unconditional love. So, let's get into this. How many of you would say that you're overloaded? How many of you would say you're either overloaded by the activity or pace of your life, or choices or changes or work or debt or worries or information or add to the list, how many of you would say that you feel deep down that you are overloaded? How many of you would say you need a sermon on how to take better care of yourself? There's a medical doctor who has influenced me, Dr. Swenson. He wrote a book titled Margin, and he defines margin as the space in between our load and our limits. The space between our load and our limits. His contention is that most of us have very little margin. That most of us, if we're honest, are overloaded by several things. So think of your own life for a moment. How much margin is there? I like how Job said it. I have no peace, I have no quiet, I have no rest, and trouble keeps coming my way. Now, interestingly enough, if you listen to George Gallup or George Barna, the pollsters, they say that in the Christian community, regardless of the label on the front of the church, the Christian community would say that this is predominantly the emotion by which most Christians live. That most Christians struggle to have margin. Most Christians struggle to get enough sleep. Most Christians struggle to be able to take care of ourselves in a healthy way and not feel guilty about it. One of the most significant books that I have ever read in my life was titled, When I Relax, I Feel Guilty. Can any of you relate? So, Dr. Swenson says that living with margin is not using all that we have, but reserving some of our time, our energy, our resources for a meaningful and purposeful life. Now, we have been blessed in order to be a blessing. Dr. Swenson says that he was practicing medicine and he was gifted. He gives all credit to God, but he was gifted as a diagnostician. He said that he could just smell disease, and his colleagues would call him in and say, I can't figure out what's wrong with this patient. And God uniquely gifted him to be able to say, this is what it was. And he was getting called and called and called, and he said his life had very little margin. And one night his wife said to him, what's wrong with you? And he said, I don't know, but something is. She said, well, you have no margin. And that's what led to his journey of self-care. And it led to the writing of 5 books on how to create margin in our lives. And the thing that he says, and he's a very devout follower of Jesus, he says, the thing I say, we're not about creating margin just to create margin, as important as that is. We are creating margin because then we can make a more significant difference in this world with the life that we have. So, how much margin do you have in your life, if you're to be honest, physically, emotionally, mentally, relationally, financially? How much margin do you have? And here's the thing, when we don't have much margin, it leads to stress. And when we have a whole bunch of stress, it leads to a feeling like this. So, how many of you would say you have the sunset syndrome? How many of you know what it is? You might be on Jeopardy someday, Jay, so pay attention now. The sunset syndrome is exactly what Dr. Swenson said happened to him when his wife said, what's wrong with you? The sunset syndrome is based on the idea that those to whom we have made the greatest commitments are the ones for whom we have the least amount of energy. Sunset syndrome. The ones that we've made the greatest commitment to are the ones who get the leftovers. Now, you don't have to be a medical doctor to practice being in the sunset syndrome. You don't have to be a medical doctor to be diagnosed with that. That can apply to any of us. And the other thing that we all know is that according to Barna and according to George Gallup, when they poll Christians about our health and wellness, we're plagued with sunset syndrome and we're plagued with hurry sickness. And what's hurry sickness? Well, it's what I did the other day when I was in Dillon's at 37th and Woodlawn, and there was a person in the 15 items or less line. And if you get a 12-pack of Gatorade, you know those little bottles of Gatorade? Is that one item or 12? Have you thought about it? These are important things to think about. So this person had 5 12 packs of Gatorade. What was I feeling inside? Frustration. In my mind, there were 60 items in a 15-item lane. I wanted to say, "Ma'am, look at the sign." That's hurry sickness. Have you noticed how much construction there is in Wichita? Have you noticed that these roads that go down to one lane? The other day I went through 5 cycles of the red, yellow, green cycle, and it was just inching along. And then this man had the audacity to drive all the way past those of us who were inching along, turn on his signal, and some merciful soul let them in. Now that's not fair, is it? But it's a symptom, you see, of hurry sickness. And I'm thinking, what's wrong with this picture? And I was really asking, what's wrong with me that it's bothering me? So, what's the benefit if we were to live with margin? We'd be healthier. Wouldn't we? We'd be healthier in our mind, we'd be healthier in our body, we'd be healthier in our relationships. We'd be more attentive and more available for God's purposes. You know why I was saying, have you noticed how beautiful it is? One of the reasons that I said that during our greeting time is because when we don't have much margin, we don't see much beauty. I have been astounded by the beauty that's around us. But I have to confess that if I weren't preparing for this sermon, I don't know that I would have noticed it. So let's get on the solution side. How do we live with more margin? This self-care topic is vitally important, but it begins with accepting that you and I have been created by God with limitations. Now that's not always easy to accept. The psalmist says it this way, I've learned that everything has limits. If you read it in the New English translation, it says, by God's design. Everything has limits by God's design. Have you ever experienced being at the end of your limit? Your limits. So, Pastor Ben read the psalm. I love Psalm 121, but for many years I didn't understand it. I was confused by it. Well, confused is not the right word. I was comforted by it, but for the wrong reason. I guess that's part of confusion. So when you look at verse 1, I lift up my eyes to the hills, from where does my help come? What's that saying? I used to think that it means that I get to go to Colorado and I look at those beautiful Rocky Mountains, and if I look at those beautiful Rocky Mountains, it reminds me of God's splendor and God's majesty and God's beauty and God's glory and God's strength, and if only I look up, then I will have what I need. Wrong. The psalmist is saying, I look up at the place that is my challenge. I look at my obstacle. I look at that which is beyond me. That's what in the original language of Hebrew it means. I look at my greatest challenge. What am I going to do when I'm smack dab facing the fact that I have limitations? So as the psalm goes on, I'll just give you a little snippet. May I? Thank you, Benjamin. It only takes one. This is like an auction here. Verse 6. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. This is a psalm that is an admission of limitation over and over and over. And I'm just giving you another example. One of the limitations is walking. So if you go out during the day, what does the sun do? Now, Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us this, that the Jews of this day believed what about the sun? That it was so hot that it would bake your brain and make you stupid. I'm putting it in plain English here. So you didn't want to journey during the heat of the day because it would bake your brain and make you stupid. And you didn't want to go out at night because what did the moon do to you? Well, you've heard that word lunatic. That comes from what word? Lunar. Moon. The people in this day believed that if you walked out at night and you were journeying, that the moon would make you crazy. Over and over and over again, the psalmist is saying, I have limitations, I have limitations, I have limitations. Do you understand why he says, where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. And he names the limitations, and he names the fact that he trusts God to help him with his limitations. Now, when's the last time you found yourself coming smack dab confronting your limitations? Here's another thing that I want to invite us to do. This gets a little harder. You see why I said nobody's going to leave here today and say, wow. Why is it that we struggle with margin? Because we overfunction. We try to do too much because we don't really believe that we have limitations. So we try to defy the reality that we have limitations. And we push, and we push, and we push, and we do, and we do, and we do. Now please, do not misunderstand me. I am not advocating that we be idle. Being idle and being overactive are equally dangerous for different reasons. There's a sweet spot of being appropriately active at the appropriate time for the appropriate reason to get the appropriate results. And because we have human limitations, we don't always know where that is. That's why we're dependent upon God. So this overfunctioning, I teach this in Parenting with Love and Logic. It's a Parenting with Love and Logic principle. It's actually a very spiritual, biblical principle. Anything that is true really is. That in a relationship between a parent and a child, if you have a parent who's over-functioning, you will automatically have a child who's under-functioning. So if you want your under-functioning child to function at a higher level, you've got to lower your level of functioning as a parent. This is a universal principle. And that's one of the reasons why we struggle to have margin in our lives, because we have people that are over-functioning. And guess what? Our culture will reward people who over-function. I have a pastor friend who sleeps 5 hours a night, goes to bed at 3 a.m., or actually works till 3 a.m., goes to bed and sleeps till 8 a.m. every day. And he says, I'm doing great things for God. This is really important. And I said, no, you're not really being wise. So he and I had a friendly little conversation called an argument. And I said to him, with as much seriousness as I could muster. So, you stroke out because of no margin in your life, and you think God is glorified by that? I've been given the spiritual gift of irritation. Every once in a while I practice it. Another one of my pastor friends who sleeps less than 5 hours a night was doing a baptism. And during the baptism, it was time for him to pray. And he said, "Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep." And then he kind of came to and said, "What did I just pray?" And everybody laughed. And after the laughter settled down, he said to me, "You know, that's pretty serious business, isn't it?" I said, "Yeah." You're that tired that you fell asleep standing up doing a baptism. And is God glorified by that? Not that he messed up. Don't get me, I'm not picking on that. I'm just saying that if he dies of a massive heart attack, are we going to applaud him for the fact that he slept 3 hours a day? See, we have to get in touch with why we overfunction. Become more self-aware. And here's the thing. Richard Foster, the great Quaker, says this, and I believe it to be absolutely gospel truth. When you and I say yes, we have to be aware of what we're saying no to. Every yes automatically means that we're saying no to somebody or something, and every no means that we're saying yes to somebody or something. There is no yes without a no, and there's no no without a yes. And when we're too quick to say yes, then we also take away the opportunity for somebody else to say yes. Guilty as charged. So, you ready for a harder one? Now, I warned you, didn't I? Practice a weekly Sabbath. What's a Sabbath? Now, don't get caught up in the day. Just think of it as a 24-hour period of time of not doing anything that you have to do. It's a 24-hour period of time where you don't do anything that you have to do. Another one of my pastor friends was in seminary in Wilmore, Kentucky, and it was a Sunday afternoon, and he was mowing his lawn. And all the neighbors came out when he was through and said, "Do you know where you live?" He said, "Yeah, Wilmore, Kentucky." They said, "Well, you don't mow lawns on the Sabbath." "Oh, really?" "Nope, not here." Now, hear this. Unfortunately, see, it had become a legalism. And that's why I started where I did. If we're not careful, this whole Sabbath-keeping business can become, okay, God's going to give me brownie points, and God's going to love me more, and God's going to bless me more, and it has absolutely nothing to do with that. So I always tell people, if mowing the lawn during your time of Sabbath, no matter what day it is something that gives you life, do it. If it's something you have to do, don't. Now, I'm going to say this quickly and I've got to close. When we hear this scripture that Dr. Jen read, when God is saying to the children of Israel, "I want you to keep a Sabbath." This is one of the 10 commandments, not the 10 suggestions. And it's so amazing to me that we think we can break this one and it's no big deal. If I break this commandment, you're not going to say, Jeff, this is a serious issue. If you break this commandment, I'm not going to say, you need to really be careful. Right? And yet, here's the thing. Why did God make this one of the 10 commandments? Breaking the 10 commandments is really a misnomer. You and I can't break them in that they're eternal. But if we don't keep them, they break us. And that's the point that God's making. If you choose not to keep a Sabbath, you will become a slave again, just like you were. It's a matter of life or death. And that's why Jesus was saying, see, the Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. Don't turn this into a legalism. Don't turn this into a woulda, shoulda, coulda kind of thing. It's a prescription for life. Well, I want to close by showing you this from our neighborhood. What kind of a tree is that? It's a big one, yes. A Bradford pear tree. This is our front yard. Now, besides the fact that there are two different kinds of trees, what's the difference? This one is really full, and this one has been pruned. All the dead has been taken out. The arborist said, this tree is dying, but you'd never know it. And why is it dying? It's too full. There's no room to breathe. Trees, he said, need space, need margin to breathe, to be well. You see, God built this into the whole of creation. On the surface, that looks beautiful. On the surface, this doesn't. Which is more whole? This or this? Which is more like your life? This or this? Let's have some moments of silent prayer and reflection.